When a great storyline plays itself out, it can be absolute magic to watch. Just look at the explosion of the Mega Powers, or the domination of the Bloodline if you need any evidence of that. But what about those angles that aren't so great, the stories that for one reason or another fail to connect with fans in the way they were intended to? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with one of the worst of them all, and that's Shawn Michaels' 2018 return as part of D-Generation X. Yes, you could argue that outside of Ric Flair in 2008, no one has had a better send-off from the ring than the Heartbreak Kid has, as he got to go out having back-to-back classics with The Undertaker on consecutive years at WrestleMania. And considering his first run had ended so abruptly when a back injury forced him to hang up his boots in 1998, this was especially meaningful to both him and his fans. But it seems the curse of wrestlers never being able to remain in retirement struck with Shawn here, as after spending 8 years committed to remaining out of the ring, he eventually caved and laced up his boots once more when the promise of money became too much for him to turn down. That's right, at Crown Jewel on November 2nd of that year, the showstopper returned to the ring for one night only. The only problem was that this turned out to be the most cursed wrestling show of all time. That's right, the tag team main event pitting D-Generation X against the Brothers of Destruction was so bad it quickly became the laughingstock of the wrestling world. And sure, you could argue HBK was the only thing barely holding this one together, so he shouldn't be blamed for the debacle which occurred that night, but it was still his big return party, so most people are going to associate it with him anyway. Thankfully then, since that night, Shawn Michaels has returned to retirement and remained there, giving us all the chance to memory hole this one out of existence. One thing we can't memory hole no matter how hard we try though is our next failed storyline, and that's the catastrophe that was his Clique stablemate's time in WCW as Last Call Scott Hall. Now, there are certain things that just shouldn't be used in a wrestling angle as they're a little too close to the bone. Real-life threatening illnesses would be a prime example of this, as would the whole Chris Benoit situation. And you could argue that real-life cases of alcoholism should also be included in such a category, like in the case of Scott Hall. Yes, the bad guy's battles with addictions have long been documented, as they hounded him throughout much of his career and life. So why WCW thought it was a good idea to use this in an angle which made fun of him in 1998 is anyone's guess. That's right, the idea here was that if the former four-time Intercontinental Champion was going to be drunk behind the scenes most of the time during the latter days of World Championship Wrestling, then that should be his on-screen gimmick too, which is exactly why he started coming out to the ring staggering about like a man in the midst of a 3-day bender. Was he actually drunk on these occasions, or was he just playing it up for the camera? Honestly, it could have been either, but if it was the former, then that makes the whole thing even worse, as his opponents' lives were being put at risk. But even if it was just an act, it doesn't make this one any less tasteless, and a prime example of the worst kind of stuff turn of the millennium era wrestling could give us. Hell, it wasn't even entertaining as a storyline, meaning there was absolutely no value to this one. And Scott Hall wasn't the only big name in WCW who was suffering as a result of a botched angle during 1998 either, as the same thing would be happening to Sting around the same time. Sure, you could argue the Icon's character arc in 1996 and 1997 had been perfect, all except for the ending of Starrcade 97 that was. But once things ticked over into 1998, it all went downhill for him immediately. And this was when WCW has the idea to have him join the NWO Wolfpack. And in Sting's case, this was particularly egregious because, after spending the better part of 2 years being the last bastion of the Southern wrestling tradition, some standing tall against the invading force of the NWO, he'd end up joining the group. No, you didn't hear us wrong. It was in 1998 that the Stinger painted his face red and became the newest member of the NWO Wolfpack, making all his prior time as the man trying to defend his company from them absolutely pointless in retrospect. And sure, the Wolfpack were more of a babyface offshoot of the original team, but Sting being a part of any group at this time just didn't feel right, as his character was always more of a loner by nature. Seriously, we can't even blame this one on Vince Russo, as he wasn't with the company at the time. Hell, so bad was it that it pretty much signaled the jumping of the shark for everything around it, including the NWO as a stable and the company of WCW itself. And that's why it shouldn't come as any surprise that around about the time that this whole debacle was taking place, WWF were shooting ahead in the ratings and would never look back again as the Monday Night Wars became a one-horse race. That said, once the Monday Night Wars ended in 2001, Vince McMahon wouldn't exactly have a perfect track record, as his Ruthless Aggression era gave us its fair share of botched storylines too. And perhaps none of these were worse than the time he decided to introduce us to the Burchills. That's right, one of many examples of Vince McMahon's fascination with incest angles. But, well, most of these thankfully never made it to the screen. In the case of Paul and Katie Lee Burchill, it was unfortunately all on show for late 2008's Raw audiences, as at this point, they'd be written to be a brother-sister duo who were a little too close for comfort. Seriously, in the annals of all-time creepy wrestling angles, this has to rank right up there alongside the whole Katie Vick storyline. And it's clear neither Paul nor Katie Lee were comfortable taking part in it either, as they were obviously just as grossed out as everyone else was. That said, the pair went along with the script and made the best out of it that they could. And after we all had to endure almost a full year of this one, it was mercifully scrapped and everyone involved decided to just pretend it didn't happen. Of course, this wasn't the only failed storyline of the Ruthless Aggression era though. No, far from it, as 3 years earlier in 2005, fans everywhere were treated to the absolute lowlight that was Stuttering Morgan. Yes, it's 2005, business is down, and we need to recapture the attention of the mainstream that stopped watching in 2001 when Steve Austin turned heel. WWE decided to run one of the more confusing angles in company history when they placed Matt Morgan into a stuttering gimmick. Honestly, is it any surprise this one flopped so hard? What is there to even say about it other than who the hell thought this would ever be a good idea even in the mid-2000s? Not Matt Morgan, that's for sure. As you could tell, he was struggling to get into the character every time he appeared on screen. And sure, part of the reason for that is because Matt Morgan wasn't exactly the Undertaker in terms of his character work. But it was almost certainly also because he knew this one was dead on arrival, as all it amounted to was a large man who stuttered and felt self-conscious about it, then took out all of his subsequent rage on his opponents. Yeah, there's a reason wrestling has a reputation as being low rent for many in the mainstream, and it's because of stuff like this. So, thankfully it didn't last long then, as by July of that year, Morgan would have left WWE and moved on to pastures new when he briefly became a member of the New Japan roster. Of course, as he was doing his best to rebuild himself over in Japan, there was another big man who was taking his first leap into the WWE system. Sadly though, the early days of Drew McIntyre's run would be hampered by a pretty bad gimmick too, in the form of the Chosen One. Now, we say bad, but this one didn't have to go that way. In fact, it could have been good if all had gone to plan. After all, the idea here was to take a big athletic Scotsman who had all the potential in the world and turn him into a top-level star by having Vince McMahon give him his personal on-screen seal of approval. The only problem with such an idea, though, was that Drew clearly wasn't ready for the spot yet. No, while he's undeniably great today, especially in his current heel role, back then he was far too green to have the rocket strapped to him. And so that was why, despite being somewhat over on the 2009 SmackDown roster, and even picking up notable wins against the likes of R-Truth, John Morrison, and Kane, all en route to winning the Intercontinental title, it was clear pretty quickly that it was all a case of too much too soon for the Iron Native. And this led to him starting to fall down the card as early as 2010. Hell, during his run, he'd never even sniffed the main event scene that had been offered to him on a platter initially. Rather, he'd end up in the role of comedy jobber alongside Jinder Mahal and Heath Slater as part of 3MB come 2012. Still, at least Drew would get a second chance, as upon being fired by WWE in 2014, he'd rebuild himself in places like TNA. And once he did that, he'd return to WWE in 2017 and go on to become a one-time NXT champion, two-time WWE champion, and 2020 Men's Royal Rumble winner. So at least there was a happy ending to his story. But had he not been given the albatross of expectation around his neck that was the Chosen One gimmick so early on, then he might never have had to wait so long to reach this level of success. And maybe today, we'd be talking about him as being an even bigger star than he already is. Of course, being a big star is no guarantee you won't be put in another botched storyline though. No, even being the biggest star doesn't make you immune from this, and if you need any evidence of that, just look at our next subject, Roman Reigns, and his ill-fated big dog feud with Baron Corbin in late 2019 and 2020. That's right, while he may have finally gotten over with fans today as the tribal chief, back in 2019, Roman Reigns was the absolute peak of having to deal with the awful creative surrounding him, as this was the point where, 5 years into his run as the apparent face of the company, he was still being given the worst of the worst to work with. Why was this? Well, Vince McMahon was still writing the show back then. And as we all know, the thing that makes the boss laugh hardest is elementary school potty humor. And so it was then he decided the best angle to give Roman at the turn of the decade wasn't to have him get into a heated program with someone like Seth Rollins or have him put on a series of bangers against AJ Styles or Daniel Bryan. No, instead it was to have him go toe-to-toe with Baron Corbin in a feud which centered around dog food. Yeah, dog food. After all, Roman was the big dog, and we're playing for the cheapest pops possible here, so why wouldn't things revolve around one trying to feed the other a meal designed for canines? Truly, this was the absolute nadir of Roman Reigns as a character, and the fact that he was able to come back from it all says a lot about how talented he is, because for most people, this would have been the ultimate killing blow. Hell, Reigns was fully aware how bad it was, and that's why once he took a sabbatical from the ring soon thereafter, he decided to put his foot down and demand some changes be made if he was going to return to the ring at all, with those changes including no more bad angles and an opportunity for him to show what he could do as a heel instead. Would this work out? Yeah, it certainly did, because for the past few years in WWE, the Bloodline angle has been the hottest thing in the entire industry. But that's not to say there haven't been failed angles elsewhere in WWE during this time period, such as their infamous attempt at recreating an NWO-type angle, that being Retribution. Okay, where do we start with Retribution? Perhaps no other faction in modern history has become a punchline so quickly, and with good reason too. What were the reasons? Well, because this one was so stupid right out of the gate it was impossible not to laugh as these bad Scooby-Doo villains came out to the ring with their funny-looking masks and tried to make us all believe they were a serious threat to anyone. Sure, we know it was the lockdown and WWE were trying anything they could to grab fans' attention, but there had to have been better ideas than taking Dominik Dijak, Dio Maddin, Shane Haste, Mercedes Martinez, and Mia Yim and having them be rebranded as T-Bar, Mace, Slapjack, Retaliation, and Reckoning. Seriously, if there was ever a career killer of a gimmick, then this was it, as how was anyone supposed to take someone named Slapjack seriously? And it's not like the people involved didn't know how bad it was. No, they were all too aware, with Mercedes Martinez outright refusing to take part in it after the first few weeks, as she instead returned to NXT. Hell, even when Mustafa Ali was brought on board as the group's new leader a month after their debut, it only dragged him down instead of raising everyone else around him up. But then, what would you expect when this was a group who got jobbed out at every opportunity, something which didn't exactly help their claims that they were there to take over WWE. Thankfully though, given the fact that they were under masks, the members of Retribution have been able to mostly bounce back in the years since, with Mia Yim carving out a nice role for herself on SmackDown, Dominik Dijak moving over to NXT, Shane Haste and Mustafa Ali venturing over to Japan, Dio Maddin becoming one half of the national treasures that were the Maximum Male Models, and Mercedes Martinez making her mark in AEW. But while Martinez has had a decent run there, it's not like Tony Khan's company have been strangers to botched angles themselves. Need we remind you all about the horror show that was the Nightmare Collective? That's right, if there's been one consistent criticism of AEW throughout its 5-year history, it's that its women's division hasn't been booked very strongly. And perhaps no angle better personifies this awful booking than the Nightmare Collective. What is it? Well, it was Brandy Rhodes' attempt to start a cult-like stable of women. At least we think that's what it was, because none of it was ever clearly defined. All we got in terms of explanation, in fact, was that one day Brandy was the loving wife of Cody Rhodes, and then the next she was some kind of voodoo queen who designated herself as the manager of Awesome Kong. And as the weeks went on and Kong began collecting victories, they'd start adding new recruits to their group in the form of Mel and Luther, all while they were taking a lock of hair from each of their victims too. Honestly, of all the angles in AEW history, this might be the worst, even worse than the Hardy family office. And it helped to set a precedent for the women's division in Jacksonville being a Deadlands where the occasional burst of greatness from the likes of Britt Baker, Jamie Hayter, or timeless Toni Storm would be drowned out by a sea of random matches with no story in their one designated slot on Dynamite each week. We can only hope that the much-rumored Mercedes Moné signing actually happens then, because a star of her level will no doubt force AEW to elevate the division. But even if it does, it'll never take away from how bad the Nightmare Collective was, and how much we were all thankful when it was dropped abruptly in early 2020. After all, if AEW had stuff like this going on while there were no audiences in attendance instead of the Hangman Page saga and the world title run of Jon Moxley, then it might have been enough to kill the viewership dead during the early days of the worldwide shutdown and send the company into a tailspin from which they may have never recovered. But thankfully AEW did survive 2020, and thankfully WWE did too, because as we all know, wrestling thrives when there's competition. Of course, WWE did have their fair share of struggles when it came to writing compelling angles during the Thunderdome era though. And no, we're not talking about Retribution here. Rather, we're talking about the other failed angle of the time period, Raw Underground. Now, again, this one had the potential to be a good idea. Hell, if there were no fans in arenas, then it made all the sense in the world to turn the third hour of Raw into an underground fight club where performers could wrestle in more of a shoot style. If nothing else, it made it feel a little bit different from everything else on TV. The only problem, though, was that any potential Raw Underground had was quickly lost when, rather than letting guys and girls with actual shoot fighting skills like Otis, Dolph Ziggler, or Shayna Baszler dominate the proceedings, it was instead turned into a vehicle to get over a couple of giants, namely Braun Strowman and Dabba-Kato. Yes, in the end, this was less of a cool David Fincher movie and more of a bad remake of something Hulk Hogan would have starred in during the 80s. And it was made all the worse by having Shane McMahon right there to carry out what could charitably be described as commentary over the top of the proceedings. Seriously, Shane McMahon has his strong points, but sitting behind the commentary booth most certainly isn't one of them. In fact, we go as far as to say that he's about as good at this as he is at doing leapfrogs over The Miz at WrestleMania. So thank God Raw Underground will be dropped after a month or so then, with the reasons for this varying depending on who you ask. Whatever the reason, the right decision was made at the end of the day, as this one was nothing less than an unmitigated disaster and a sign that Raw really needed a change in creative direction come the turn of the decade. But that's not to say Triple H has been perfect since he took over as head of creative in 2022 either. No, he's had his botches, and one of the biggest of these was his decision to have Austin Theory cash in his Money in the Bank contract on a mid-card title. Now, to be fair, this isn't entirely the game's fault, as he inherited the character of Mr. Money in the Bank Austin Theory from Vince McMahon before he stepped down in the summer of that year. But that didn't mean he had to botch the payoff to the whole thing so badly. Sure, by this point, many believed that the Atlanta native wasn't ready to become the star WWE had hoped for quite yet. Still, though, he could have benefited from at least attempting to take down Roman Reigns and looking strong in defeat. But not even seeing Theory at this level, Triple H chose to go a different route with him instead when he had him become the first person to cash in his Money in the Bank contract on a mid-card title. That's right, rather than go after the world title, the former Evolve star went after the United States strap, and what made this all the worse was that he didn't even win that belt. No, he'd actually fail in his attempt to cash in against Seth Rollins here in what was a truly baffling example of botching a surefire winner. Sure, he would win the belt a few weeks later during a rematch, but that only made things feel even more nonsensical, as there was even less reason for him to lose the first time around. Really, there's an outside chance we might look back on this as the moment the Money in the Bank contract jumped the shark in years to come, as it's a little bit harder to take it seriously after such a debacle as what occurred in 2023. That said, there's always the chance it will bounce back, so long as there's no more botched storyline associated with it, like any of the ones we've discussed today.